Hi everyone, Crista Cowan here with another episode of the Barefoot Genealogist. Today we are talking about paleography, or learning to read the handwriting on old documents. If you've been doing family history at all for any length of time, you know that that is a really important skill to have. And every day somebody posts something on social media or sends an email saying, "Can you read this?" So today I'm going to give you some of my best tips and tricks for how to read some of those old documents. Whether it's a name on a census record or a cause of death on a death certificate or the obscure name of that little town in Eastern Europe where your ancestors came from that's written on the passenger list. I want you to be able to find that information. So let's go ahead and dive in. First, let's talk about how we learn how to read. We learn how to read by reading words, recognizing the shape of a word, recognizing the pattern of the letters together. However, when we are doing paleography or trying to transcribe or read the handwriting on old documents, we have to get out of that habit. We have to train our brain to read a document letter by letter instead of trying to read the whole word. Part of the reason is because of the variance in handwriting. Some of it is because of the variations in spelling. And some of it is because of the way that letters are shaped differently in different periods of time. And so get in the habit of reading a word letter by letter instead of trying to read the entire word. It's a skill and it takes some practice, but it's totally possible. We'll look at some examples in a little bit. Next, this is probably the number one top tip for reading old documents, and that is to get in the habit of comparing the word you're trying to read with other writing on the page and other records in the collection. What this means is, I see this all the time, people will cut out a little snippet of an image and post it on Facebook and say, "Can anybody help me read that?" The problem is that there's no context. So in order to have context, you have to look at all the other words on a page. You have to look at how a particular writer forms certain letters. And sometimes when you can read one word and understand what the letters in that word are, you can then compare that word to the word you're trying to decipher. Now, on a page of census records, this is really easy because there's a lot of things written on that one page. But if you're looking at a death certificate, sometimes that means you need to go forward and backward several pages in order to see how this particular person wrote certain letters. But that also means you need to pay attention to who it was that was writing those documents. In a census, the pages before and after were usually written in the same handwriting by the same enumerator. But if you're looking at a set of death certificates, sometimes they've been reordered to be alphabetical or by county, or instead of being chronological. And so you may be looking at a different writer. So always pay attention to who it is that wrote out that particular certificate. On passenger lists and other documents like census records, again, you've got a lot of information on a single page, and sometimes you can go forward and backward just one page and get enough context in order to see how a particular person writes their letters. We need to not expect standardized spelling as well. Standardized spelling really didn't come about until the early 1900s. And even then, it wasn't consistent. So don't expect that a name will be spelled the way you expect it to be, or that a location will be spelled the way you expect it to be. Even on something like a death certificate where a doctor or a medical examiner may have filled out that information, just because they were educated and could read and write does not mean that you can expect standardized spelling. So sometimes what you have to do is get a little creative. When you've laid out what each of the letter by letter combinations are, then try saying that word out loud. And depending on where you are and who it is that wrote the record, try saying it with some kind of an accent or a regional dialect. It sounds silly, but I do this all the time where my family's from the South, and I'll say things with the Southern accent that my grandmother had my whole life, and I'll realize, oh, that's how that would be spelled. If I heard that, this is how I would spell it. And so sometimes it's not that it's spelled wrong, it's just that it's spelled the way that it sounded in whatever particular accent they had. So sometimes we have to get a little bit creative with not just how things are spelled, but how we hear things. Another important tip is that sometimes we stare at something so long, or we try so hard to figure it out that we lose all perspective. And so I have found very often that if I just ask someone else, hey, can you come here and take a look at this? What does this say? Sometimes they can get it right away because they have fresh eyes. If that's not an option, another trick that I've found that works well is that if I just go away for a while, if I just set that document aside and come back to it the next morning, I have fresher eyes and I'm able to see something that maybe I hadn't been able to see before. So be willing to walk away or ask someone for assistance. And then the final tip that I have for you, and then we'll look at some examples, is to understand the background of the document. And here's where that becomes important. If you're just looking at a census record or a death certificate or a passenger list and trying to interpret a name or a cause of death or a location, that's challenging enough. But once you spend a little bit of time doing family history, and once your tree gets a little bit further back in time, you're going to have to deal with even more complicated documents. You're going to have to deal with parish registers and land deeds and court documents and wills, and all of those are going to be handwritten, and some of them are going to be handwritten in Latin or in Old English. Some of them are going to be, in language that you don't understand. Even though it's English, it may look like a totally foreign language to you. And so one of the things that I've learned is that if you understand the background of the document, you can start to pick out common words and phrases. In wills, there are some very common phrases that are used over and over again. Most of the wills that I have seen begin with, in the name of God, amen, or I, so-and-so, being of sound mind and body, or, there's some common phrases that you're going to see. The same thing with parish registers, the same thing with land records and court records. There's going to be some template or boilerplate language that's going to be used in those documents, even though the whole thing is handwritten. And so if you become familiar with that boilerplate language, then you can see how they form certain letters, and then you can use those letters again as comparison for the letters and the words that you don't understand. So one of the tips that I would give you is, while you are still dealing with census records and death certificates and passenger lists, while you are still dealing with some of these more simple kinds of records, I would encourage you to transcribe those records, meaning type out everything that's on that particular document as it pertains to the person or the family that you're researching. That's a really good habit to get into, so that by the time you get into more complicated records, you have developed this skill of transcribing those records. And that skill will serve you very well when you're trying to understand what those records say and what given words are on a particular page. So those are all the tips that I have for you as far as that goes. I do have some examples and some additional helps that I just want to share with you from the Ancestry website. First of all, if you go to the help, it's in the top right-hand corner of your website on ancestry.com, and type in handwriting and click search online help. You're going to find an article that we have prepared for you. It's been out there for several years. We've updated it a couple of times since then, but it's called Tips for Reading Old Handwriting. And let me just share with you a couple of the tips from this particular article, but I would encourage you to go out and read the whole thing for yourself. The first tip here, excuse me, is to pay really close attention or be careful of letters that look similar when they're written. So the example that's used here is the R and the V. So here we have the word Perry, P-A-R-R-Y, and here we have the word Novak, N-O-V-A-K. And if you look, this R and this V look identical. So again, even though these are snippets, one of the things you have to do is compare to the whole page, right? Maybe this guy wrote his R's differently than he wrote his V's. Or maybe it's a contextual thing. Or maybe you have to compare another record to know that that's what the last name of this family is. So just be really careful, and here's some combinations of letters that sometimes get confused. Pay attention to that. Another combination of letters that often gets confused by people, especially people brand new to family history, is the double S. Here is the phrase, and let me make it just a little bigger so you can maybe see it. Here is the phrase April session, S-E-S-S-I-O-N. Historically, and even through the early 1900s, when a double S was written in a word, that first S was a little fancier, and it oftentimes is confused with what we would consider an F, as in Frank. So be really careful when you see two S's. That first one sometimes looks like an F, but it's not really. It's just it's a fancy. Let's call it a fancy S for clarity's sake there. Okay, another thing you need to be careful of is what we call watch the humps. There are letters M, N, W, U, depending on how they're written. They're humped letters, and sometimes the record keeper did not count his own humps, so he didn't make enough. And so sometimes we confuse things because we think, oh, I counted and there weren't enough humps for that to be an M, so it must be an N. So you just have to be careful of that. Sometimes that happens. Another thing to be wary of is uncrossed T's and undotted I's. Some people were not careful enough to cross the T's the way that they should have. So here you see the word Maddie, and it is Maddie. It's not Molly or Mally. Okay, these are T's, even though the cross is done over here, right? So he just got sloppy and did not actually make the cross go across the two T's. It looks like also the I is dotted over the E, okay? So sometimes you just need, again, you need some context. You need to look at how he does his other letters and see if that's a consistent problem. Does he consistently not cross the T's or not dot the I's or do it off to the side? Also in this particular article, you're going to find a few resources that I would encourage you, if you're new at this, to spend some time with. One is a letter chart where we've got capital and lowercase versions of all the letters of the alphabet, so that you can just quickly see how different people make those different letters. Sometimes we get so caught up in the way that we create a certain letter that we don't realize that there might be some random variations of that. So there's a little chart, and then below that we've just got some examples of words, again, just to help you kind of get a feel for how different letters and shapes are formed over different periods of time. Now, these are mostly going to be for census kinds of records. We'll talk about some earlier records here in just a minute. Let's look at this example. Again, this is from a census, and I love this example. This is in the Family History Wiki. So if you go to the Learning Center on Ancestry, the Family History Wiki is the bottom option on that menu. And we have some handwriting helps out there too, particularly because we have an indexing program called the Ancestry World Archives Project, where members of our community go out and help index records. And all records that are indexed by the Ancestry World Archives Project community are available for free. So those records those indexes are made available for free on Ancestry. And anybody who participates in, excuse me, anybody who participates in the World Archives Project, I know they do contests and sometimes have little prizes, and then there's also some discounts available for active keyers. So if you're interested in getting involved in that, if you just go to the Collaborate tab on Ancestry, you'll see more information about that. But because of that, on the Family History Wiki, there are some additional handwriting helps, because this community of people are actually transcribing or creating indexes from original records. And so it's really helpful to have these resources available to the rest of us who are trying to read records. So here's a census record, and if you look at the third name down on this particular record, just at a glance, if I was reading the word instead of reading letter by letter, I might think that that said Cufud, C-U-F-U-D. Now, that's not a word as far as I know. It's not a name in particular. Maybe it's an abbreviation for something. Maybe it's a nickname for something. I don't know, okay? But if I was reading this letter by letter, I might come to a different conclusion, okay? So we have a C here and a U, and then this looks like an F. But if you compare it to the F up here in the word wife, you'll see that it actually looks different. This F and this F are not the same. So that leads me to believe, since I know that this is an F, that this is not an F. And it's not, in fact, it's a P. And it might be hard to see if you're not familiar with how P's were sometimes formed. Sometimes they went way above the line, and rather than a loop right here, it's just a little uptick. So you have this P and then I-D. So instead of this name being Cufud, this name is actually Cupid. Okay? So, really useful, again, to compare with other letters on the page before you come to a conclusion about what a particular word might be. Now, lots of helps there. I'd encourage you to read that entire article and some of the other resources available out there. Last thing I want to share with you is, for those of you, now this was just a basic introduction to paleography, but there are some of you who have been doing this for a while and are already getting into some of those old documents, some of those old Latin parish registers and wills and other probate records and land records and court records. Some of those records, particularly as you go back into New England and then back into England or into Germany, Italy, some of those records date back to the 1600s, the 1500s, and the handwriting changes drastically the further back you go. Sometimes the way in which they formed letters looks completely foreign, and so you could be reading something in English and it does not look like English at all. So, one of the best resources I've found for tutorials on reading some of those old English documents in particular was put out by the National Archives of England. So their website here is nationalarchives.gov.uk. And then if you go /paleography, you're going to come to this paleography tutorial where they walk you through each of these little links. Here is a different module where they give you some a class and a little resource and some tutorials, and then they give you some practice doing some things, and then they have a little game, which I love, where you actually have to try to read the word. It's kind of in like a hangman fashion before the little lady on the dunking stool gets dunked in the river. But it's really useful to practice reading some of these old documents when it doesn't matter, because the reality is that once we start getting into our own family history, it does matter. It matters that we read that name correctly, or that we read that occupation or that location correctly, because all of that information is necessary for us to create a clear picture of who this person was in our tree. Because if we don't know who this person was, if we don't have a really good understanding, then when we try to move back to the next generation, we could find ourselves climbing someone else's family tree or making incorrect assumptions or attaching the wrong family. So hopefully this has been useful information. If you're watching this live, I will be on chat in just a few minutes to answer any additional questions you may have. I'll also share those links to some of those tutorials for those of you who are interested in those. That's all I have for you today. Until next time, this is Crista Cowan. Have fun climbing your family tree.